Hi, second in a series of tutorials about intervals, basically looking at the gaps between notes rather than concentrating so much on the actual notes themselves. This is the second video. If you haven't seen the first one, I'll put a link to it in the info section on YouTube down there. So have a look at that first, because it sets up some important groundwork which you probably need to be familiar with before looking at this video. That video basically looked at the major scale and looked at the intervals involved in that. And what we said, just to quickly recap, we said in the major scale we have an interval of 0 semitones between the first degree and itself, an interval of 2 semitones between the first and second degree, we call that a major second. We have an interval of 4 semitones between the first and the third degree, we call that a major third. An interval of 5 semitones between the root and the fourth degree, call that a perfect fourth. An interval of 7 semitones between the root and the fifth degree, call that a perfect fifth. An interval of 9 semitones between the first and the sixth degree, call that a major sixth. An interval of 11 semitones between the first and the seventh degree, call that a major seventh. And we have an interval of 12 semitones between the root note and same note name 12 semitones higher, and that's called an octave. So those are the intervals within a major scale between the root degree and the various degrees of the scale. And what we also said is that each of those intervals has its own distinctive sound. So an interval of a perfect fifth will sound like a perfect fifth regardless of what notes are involved. As long as you've got an interval of 7 semitones, it'll have that same kind of sound. And what I want to look at in this video is the missing intervals, the intervals between the root note of the major scale and the other intervals there, not the scale of tones of the major scale, but the intervals in between. Okay, so let's get started. In the major scale, we've seen that there's an interval of 0 semitones, if you like, between the first degree and itself, and there's an interval of 2 semitones between the first and second degree, that major second. So what about that interval in between, the interval 1 semitone, like that? Well, what we call that interval depends on the note names. If you're familiar with the chromatic scale, particularly if you've done any sort of scale theory and modes and so on, you should be aware that there's more than one note name for each note on the neck. So that note there is C and that note there is D. That note in between, it could be C sharp, because you could say that's a semitone higher than C. It's C raised by a semitone, so it's been sharpened, so it's C sharp. Or you could say, well, actually it's D flat, it's D lowered by a semitone, so it's D flattened. Note name is D flat. The note name that you use depends on the context that you're using it in. Okay, so something to think about, well, why you would choose possibly one note name over another. Let's think about the natural minor scale for a second. Now the natural minor scale has got the formula 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7 in the octave. So let's think about the notes that you would get in a C natural minor as opposed to a C major scale. You have a C, which is the 1 degree, a D, which is the 2 degree. The flat third degree is the third degree of E lowered by a semitone, so we always call that E flat. C, D, E flat. We don't call it D sharp because the scale formula isn't 1, 2, 2, sharp 2, it's 1, 2, flat 3. So the note is named relative to the parallel major scale, sharpened or flattened accordingly. So that's why you would use one name instead of another. I'll probably do another video in future talking about the chromatic scale and these things called enharmonic equivalents. Notes that have different names but sound the same. You know, it's the same note, but whether you call it C sharp or D flat depends on the context that you're using it in. And the context that you're using it in, the way that you name the note, also affects how you call the interval. So if we take that note there and say, well, we're going to call that C sharp, So if we say the interval between C and C sharp is 1 semitone, but because it's a C to a C type of note, it's a 1 to another type of 1, it's a sharpened 1. The interval name that we use has to be the same kind of interval name, so it's got to be some kind of unison. So if we're saying C to C is perfect unison, well, C to C sharp is what we're calling an augmented unison. It's a unison interval made a semitone larger. Augmented means you've increased it by a semitone. Looking at it the other way, we could say, well, that note's actually, we're going to call that a D flat. We've taken the D note and lowered it by a semitone. So the name that we give to the interval would have to reflect that it's some kind of second degree. So we've got C to D is a major second. The fact that we're calling it D flat, it's still some sort of second degree, some sort of 2. So we have to use a second interval type of name. So if that's a major second, 2 semitones C to D, an interval of C to D flat is what we call a minor second. And the rule in music theory is if you take a major interval and you make it a semitone smaller, it becomes a minor interval. So C to D is a major second, C to D flat is a minor second. And the same thing applies as with the other intervals. That interval there of 1 semitone, whether we'll call it augmented unison or we'll call it a minor second, sounds like that interval regardless of what notes we're playing. As long as we're going up by 1 semitone, it's always got that kind of sound. Okay, so that interval of 1 semitone, either augmented unison or minor second, depending on the note names involved. Again, there's similar logic applies when we're looking at the interval. Next one up, we've got an interval of a major second, C to D, and we've got just 2 semitones and an interval of 4 semitones, C to E, which is the major third. But what about that interval of 3 semitones? Well, that note there could either be taken as a D raised by a semitone, or it could be taken as an E lowered by a semitone. Still sounds the same. Sounds like an interval of 3 semitones, but the way that we name it depends on the note names involved. If we treat that note as being D sharp, well, it's some kind of a second degree. C to some sort of D. So we'll have to name it as some sort of second interval. And music theory says is if you take a major interval and you raise it by a semitone, it becomes augmented. Same way as we took unison and raised it by a semitone, we've got augmented unison. If we take a major second and raise it by a semitone, it becomes an augmented second. C to D sharp, 1 to a sharp 2 is an augmented second. If we look at it though as being a flattened third, we take it as E flat in this case, C to E flat. It's C to some kind of a third, in this case it's a flattened third. So we say it's a minor third degree. We have to name it some sort of third, and it's the same as we saw before when we went from C to D flat. We took a major interval, made it a semitone smaller, so we call it a minor interval. So C to E flat, 1 to flat 3, that interval is called a minor third. Okay, next up is the interval sits between the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth. In the major scale, we've got an interval of 5 semitones of a perfect fourth between the first and the fourth degree, and we've got an interval of 7 semitones or a perfect fifth between the first and the fifth degree. But what about that interval in between, the interval of 6 semitones? It's got a very distinctive sound, as you can hear. Really doom-laden sort of interval. You'll hear this in all sorts of like the classic heavy metal riffs with a diminished fifth in it. Classical music, something's called the devil's interval because it has such a strange sound. And the name that we give to that interval depends on how we name the note. Again, if we think of it as being a 4th degree raised by a semitone, then it's some kind of fourth. Now we've got an interval of 5 semitones of a perfect fourth between C and F in this example. So if we call that note there F sharp, then what we're doing is we're taking the perfect fourth interval and making it a semitone larger, so it will be known as an augmented fourth. Conversely, if we think of it as being a G flat rather than an F sharp, if we think of it, well, it's the G note made a semitone smaller, then we think of it as being a perfect fifth made a semitone smaller. So we'll call that a diminished fifth. The rule in music theory for naming intervals says if you take a perfect interval and you make it a semitone smaller, it becomes a diminished fifth. So whether you call that an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, it still has the same sound. It still has that really crazy, doom-laden, really grim sort of sound. That's the diminished fifth or the augmented fourth. Okay, next interval that we're going to look at is the one that sits between the perfect fifth and the major sixth. We've got an interval of a 7 semitone perfect fifth, and we've got an interval of a 9 semitone major sixth. There's an interval in between there of only 8 semitones. What do we call that? Well, if it's a perfect fifth raised by a semitone, it will be an augmented fifth, or if it's a 6th degree lowered by a semitone, it will be called a minor sixth. Augmented fifth, because a perfect interval made a semitone larger, is augmented. Minor sixth, because a major interval made a semitone smaller, is minor. So that 8 semitone interval is either perfect fifth raised by a semitone or a major sixth lowered by a semitone, depending on the note name involved. So in the case of C, it would be an interval of a augmented fifth if that was C to G sharp, or it would be an interval called a minor sixth if we went from C to A flat. Still an interval of 8 semitones though, and still has that same distinctive sound, but the name depends on the note names involved. Last one that we'll talk about is the interval of 10 semitones, the one that sits between the major sixth and the major seventh. We've got an interval of a major sixth here, 9 semitones. In the case of C major, that's C to A. And we've got an interval of 11 semitones from C to B. The interval in between, if that was treated as a sixth interval raised by a semitone, we would call that an augmented sixth. So in the key of C major, C to A flat, A sharp, so C to A sharp would be called an augmented sixth, because music theory says a major interval raised by a semitone is called augmented. Or if we're treating that note there as being B flat, we'll call it a minor seventh, because the interval between C and B, 11 semitones, is a major seventh. So lower that by a semitone, it becomes a minor seventh. Okay, so that covers all of the intervals within the major scale that we didn't look at on the first video. Just quickly recap those. We've got an interval of 1 semitone between the first and either the sharpened first or the flattened second, which we'd call an augmented unison or a minor second. We've got an interval of 3 semitones between the first and either the sharp second or the flat third degree. We'll call that a minor third. We've got that very distinctive sounding interval of 6 semitones between the first and either the sharp 4 or the flat fifth, which we call it a augmented fourth or diminished fifth. We've got an interval of 8 semitones between the first and either a sharp 5 or a flat 6, which we call augmented fifth or minor sixth. And we've got an interval of 10 semitones between the first and either a sharp 6 or a flat 7th degree, we will call an augmented sixth or a minor seventh. Okay, so that's covered off all of the intervals between 0 semitones and 12 semitones, and all points in between that you find in the major scale and the other notes around there. Okay, so we've built on what we saw in the first video, the notes of the intervals within the major scale, and we've now covered the intervals and named them from 0 semitones through to 12 semitones, all points in between. Now there's more to do on the theory behind intervals, but for now we'll just leave it there, because I don't want the video to get too long. I'm going to do these as a series. But the same sort of like homework for you applies as did from the first video. It's about getting your ear used to how those intervals sound. So today we've seen an interval of 1 semitone. Whether we call it an augmented unison or we call it a minor second, we have that interval that has its own unique sound as distinct from unison or a major second. It's got its own distinctive sound, and you should be able to get your ear tuned in to be able to recognise the sound of that interval, regardless of what the root note is. If it's played from C to C sharp, E to E sharp, anywhere on the neck, it'll have the same kind of sound. So just extend your ear training to be familiar with all of the intervals between 0 and 12 semitones. It's a really useful skill to have, so it is worth spending the time getting your ear trained to be able to recognise those intervals. Okay, that's all for now. Continue this in another video, and until then, keep practicing, keep training your ear, and see you soon. Bye.